So let's go ahead and begin. My name is Lynn Chavinsky from Healthy Pro. I'd like to welcome you to our session, Pivoting Your SFSP Menus, Tips and Tricks for Shifting to SSO. Today we have Hannah Gelhar and Brittany Herman presenting on behalf of ProTeam Foodservice Advisors. Hannah is a graduate of the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center Dietetic Internship Program. She received her undergraduate in nutrition and dietetics with a minor in psychology from Concordia College. As a registered and licensed dietitian, Hannah has worked as a school nutrition director in the state of Minnesota. And during that time, she served as a board member for school nutrition directors, volunteered on the nutrition conference planning committees as well. Hannah has worked for ProTeam for the past 2.5 years. She oversees the ProTeam's menu team and has the pleasure of partnering with districts to create innovative and compliant menus using the Healthy Pro software system. Brittany is a registered dietitian and consultant for ProTeam Foodservice Advisors as well, with over 7 years of experience in child nutrition at both the state and district level. She most recently served as the lead dietitian and wellness manager for Chartwell's K-12 in Duval County Public Schools, where she was responsible for the oversight of menu planning, management of special diets, interpretation of new regulations, and maintaining the USDA audit readiness. Prior to working at the district level, Brittany served as a nutrition standards program specialist for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, where she provided technical assistance and training to program sponsors. We're very lucky to have these two with us, and they are ready to begin.
Lynn, did you want to share some of these items?
Yep. Sorry about that. I jumped ahead. So we do have a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. You will be able to access that recording either through an email that's being sent out, or you can return to the Find Your Path 2021 website. We will utilize the chat on the right side of your screen. Just be sure to make that toggle on the session side so that your chat will be in that particular area for this session. If you don't see the chat, if it has closed, look for a line at the top with an intersecting arrow, and you can click there. And then should you wish to make the screen a little bit larger, you can go under the Leave button, and there will be 3 dots at that point. Once you click on those dots, you'll have the ability to pin that particular screen, which would be the presentation, and that will go to the full piece, as well as being able to make it full screen if you wish. So that is our housekeeping, and now they're ready to take it away.
Thank you, Lynn, for that great introduction. Brittany and I are happy to be here to share how to shift from using summer food service program menus to school breakfast program and national school lunch program menus. So to do so, we have a few objectives for today's session. First, participants will understand the USDA guidance for the 21-22 school year, specifically as it relates to menu planning. Secondly, you'll learn how to compare the summer food service program to the school breakfast program and national school lunch program meal patterns. We'll then put our comparison skills into action so we can determine changes needed to shift from the summer food service program to school breakfast program and national school lunch program menus. Lastly, you'll learn how to implement tips and tricks needed to make your menus compliant with both the school breakfast program and national school lunch program meal patterns and nutrient requirements. So let's go ahead and get started. Brittany, you can take it away.
All right. Thanks, Hannah. In April of this year, USDA announced a suite of child nutrition program waivers and flexibilities to support a successful school reopening in school year 2021 to 2022. USDA is allowing SSO operations to continue when schools open during the regular school year, effective July 1 of this year through June 30th of 2022. In addition, school food authorities will be allowed to claim SSO meals and snacks at the SFSP reimbursement rates. USDA also included a waiver to allow for specific school meal pattern flexibility for school year 21-22. In order to participate under the flexibilities, program operators must contact their state agency for approval to use this waiver and provide the state agency any necessary information to support the waiver request. In addition, flexibilities for non-congregate meal service times, parent-guardian pickup, and OVS flexibility for senior high schools are also in effect through June 30th of 2022, and those have been extended to the SSO program. State agencies have to elect to be subject to these flexibilities, so be sure to check with your state agency before you begin implementing any of them. Okay, so let's dive in further to what exactly is the Seamless Summer Option, or the SSO. So the SSO is a summer feeding program that has historically been an alternative to the SFSP. However, unlike the SFSP, it is only available to program sponsors who participate in the NSLP or SBP. Once approved to operate this program through your state agency, program sponsors can serve meals free of charge to children 18 years of age and under. You will need to apply for the SSO through your state agency, just like you would for any other program. Another key difference with the SSO is that, unlike the SFSP, which has its own meal pattern, sponsors operating under the SSO must follow the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program meal pattern guidelines. In the next few slides, we'll give you a refresher on these meal patterns, and then we'll share some of our top tips and tricks for how to adjust your SFSP menus to meet the NSLP and SBP meal patterns. So before we jump into the meal patterns, let's first touch on where we stand with the proposed rule around the restoration of milk, whole grain, and sodium flexibilities. So to get us all up to speed, an April 2020 court decision vacated and remanded the 2018 final rule from USDA, which had relaxed sodium, milk, and whole grain requirements for the NSLP and SBP. As a result of that decision, USDA's original standards for sodium, milk, and whole grains were then reinstated. So to make this a little bit more confusing, in November 2020, USDA issued a proposed rule that would allow program sponsors to permanently offer flavored low-fat milk as part of a reimbursable meal, allow for half the weekly grains to be whole grain rich, and provide schools participating in the NSLP and SBP more time for gradual sodium reduction by allowing target 1 sodium levels through the end of school year 2023 to 2024, continuing to target 2 in 2024 to 2025, and then eliminating the final sodium target. So that final rule has not yet been published, but USDA has provided some meal pattern flexibilities through June 30th of this year in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So program sponsors have not yet had to adjust their menus with this change. We do hope to hear more from USDA about the final rule soon. So now let's compare the school breakfast program versus the summer food service program breakfast meal patterns. If you're following Offer versus Serve, or OVS, the school breakfast program requires 4 food items to be offered from 3 food component groups, including grains, fruit, and milk. Students must then select at least 3 food items, one of which must be a half cup of a fruit or vegetable. The SFSP has similar requirements. However, if following Offer versus Serve, students can choose to decline the fruit and take the other 3 food items offered instead. The school breakfast program has both daily and weekly requirements, while the SFSP has no weekly requirements. In the school breakfast program, program sponsors have to offer 7 to 10 ounce equivalents of grain over the course of the week, and that amount is dependent on the age grade group. 5 cups of fruit and 5 cups of milk are also required to be offered over the course of the week. Another key difference between the 2 meal patterns is that the school breakfast program has dietary specifications for calories, sodium, saturated fat, and trans fat, while the summer food service program does not require a weekly nutrient analysis. So now we can take a look at the difference in the daily requirements between the two programs. So the SVP and SFSP both require a minimum of 1 grain each day, but the school breakfast program measures this in ounce equivalents, and the SFSP measures this in serving sizes. So something like a slice of bread, an ounce of dry cereal, a half cup of cooked cereal like oatmeal. The school breakfast program has whole grain rich requirements, and the SFSP does not. So they allow for, or that program allows for fortified and enriched grains to be served daily. Another difference between the two programs, meal patterns, is that the school breakfast program requires a full cup of fruit, and the SFSP only requires a half cup of fruit at breakfast. In addition, 100% juice can count towards no more than half of the fruit or vegetable servings offered over the week, while 100% juice could count towards the full fruit requirement under the SFSP breakfast meal pattern. The school breakfast program also requires that 2 varieties of milk be served and that the fat content of the milk be low fat or fat free, but the SFSP has no fat or flavored milk restrictions. If you're serving meat or meat alternates at breakfast, the school breakfast program allows for a 1 ounce equivalent of a meat or meat alternate to substitute for 1 ounce of grains after the minimum daily grains requirement is met. Or it can be served as an extra food item within the dietary specifications for the weekly menu. In the summer food service program, meat or meat alternates can only be served as an extra food item, and there aren't any dietary specifications to consider. So here's a couple snapshots of the program meal patterns. We have included a link to the school breakfast program meal pattern. That's the one featured on the left. That was created by FDACS, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So we have that in our resource slide at the end of the presentation. On this chart, you can see the differences in the grain requirements per age grade group and the differences in the calorie ranges and sodium limits as well. The SFSP meal pattern is to the right, and that's a USDA document. And we did also include a link to that at the end of the presentation. So to quickly summarize how you would adjust your menus moving from the summer food service program to the school breakfast program, remember that the SFSP only requires a half cup of fruit, while the SVP requires a full cup. So one of the first things menu planners would need to look at would be adding an additional half cup serving of fruit. In addition, program sponsors do not need to be concerned about the weekly nutrient analysis in the summer food service program, but with shifting back to the school breakfast program, the ranges for calories, limits for sodium and saturated fat would need to be adhered to. So if you're offering a few extras on your menu, like sausage patties and gravy, you would need to take a closer look into your nutrient analysis to make sure you can still offer those items and fall within those weekly dietary specifications. Finally, with the SFSP, there are no fluid milk variety or fat requirements, but the school breakfast program does have those additional limitations and fluid milk variety requirements that we discussed previously. Okay, so now for those of us that are more visual learners, let's walk through a few examples. So what do you think? Would this menu meet the school breakfast program requirements, the summer food service program requirements, or both? So you can enter SBP, SFSP in the chat if you want to participate, and I'll give you a few seconds to think on it. All right, I'm seeing a lot of SFSP. Yes, that is correct. So this meal would only meet the SFSP requirements because we do need that full cup of fruit in the school breakfast program. In addition, there are those weekly grain requirements. So we can't exactly determine from this one example whether this would meet the weekly nutrient requirements. And then we have to offer the 2 different varieties of fluid milk as well. So to make the meal, oh, there we go. So to make the meal compliant with both programs, we could just simply add that extra half cup serving of fruit and choice of milk to make it compliant with the school breakfast program. But we would, of course, want to still keep those weekly grain requirements in mind. Okay, another example. So looking at this meal, do you think it is compliant for the school breakfast program, the summer food service program, or both? Again, if you want to enter what you think in the chat, I'll give you guys a few seconds. All right, you guys are pros. I'm seeing a lot of both. That is correct. Just a quick reminder here, it is important that you make sure that you run those weekly nutrient analysis reports to ensure that you fall within the ranges specified for calories, sodium, and saturated fat. Sometimes entree items like turkey sausage biscuits, which are higher in those nutrients, do need to be limited over the course of the week. Okay, how about this meal? Do you think this one is compliant for the school breakfast program, the summer food service program, or both? Or it might be a trick question. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of both, but someone said none, which is correct. So in this example, we do need a full cup of fruit because we have the strawberries in the parfait and the fruit juice cup, as well as meeting the fluid milk variety requirements. However, in the parfait, there's only a ½ ounce equivalent of granola, so there's only a ½ ounce equivalent of grain. And both the school breakfast program and summer food service program require that minimum of a 1 ounce equivalent grain daily. So you may be wondering, but what about the yogurt in the parfait? And remember that the guidance only allows us to substitute 1 ounce of a meat or meat alternate like yogurt for a 1 ounce equivalent of grains after that minimum daily 1 ounce grain requirement is met in the school breakfast program. So to make the meal compliant, all we would need to do is simply just adjust the amount of granola to that full 1 ounce to meet that daily grain requirement. Hannah, I will pass it over to you now so you can dive in to the differences between the SFSP and NSLP meal patterns.
Thank you, Brittany. Let's dive right into lunch meal patterns. So there are quite a few differences between the National School Lunch Program and Summer Food Service Program lunch meal patterns. First, as you see on the screen, the National School Lunch Program meal pattern includes 5 food items, and under offer versus serve, students must select 3 of 5 food items offered for the meal to be reimbursable, with that fruit or vegetable component caveat in there as well. Those 5 food items consist of grains, meat alternates, vegetables, fruit, and milk. NSLP includes both daily and weekly requirements for food items. And this slide outlines the weekly requirements, and we'll go into the daily requirements in subsequent slides. So during the week, 8 to 10 ounces of grains are needed, along with 8 to 10 ounces of meat alternates. And these components, in addition to the vegetables and fruits, vary based on the grade group. For example, those K through 8 students would need a minimum of 8 ounces of grain per week, whereas the 9 through 12 students would need a minimum of 10 ounces of grain per week. Next, we have the weekly vegetable requirements, which range from 3 3/4 cup for those K through 8 students to 5 cups for 9 through 12. And within those total amounts, we have subgroups of vegetables that we need to offer. And we'll touch more on that later in the presentation. Weekly fruit requirements range from 2.5 cups for K through 8 to 5 cups for 9 through 12. And lastly, 5 cups of milk are required weekly for NSLP. And as Brittany mentioned with the school breakfast program, the National School Lunch Program also has dietary specifications for calories, sodium, and saturated fat. and they cannot contain trans fat either. So as we look at the summer food service program on the other side of the slide, we see some differences. Under offer versus serve, students must select 3 food components from the 5 items offered for the meal to be reimbursable. And I won't go into a ton of detail here because we're focusing on the switch to NSLP, but SFSP differentiates between components and items when using OVS. Additionally, there are no weekly requirements for SFSP. There are only daily requirements, which we'll follow on the next couple slides. And lastly, SFSP does not include those dietary specifications, which you all have likely become accustomed to with serving SFSP this year. The meals do not need to stay within those calorie ranges or fall below those sodium or saturated fat levels. So next, we'll take a closer look at what is required on a daily basis for NSLP and SFSP. So continuing to the daily requirements, we'll first take a look at grains. The National School Lunch Program requires 1 ounce equivalent daily grain at K through 8 level and 2 ounce equivalent grain daily at the 9 through 12 level. And as Brittany explained earlier, we're waiting to hear if half of all the grains served will need to be whole grain rich or if all grains will need to be whole grain rich based on the final rule. At this point, waivers will be needed to deviate from serving all whole grain rich products, so check with your state agency on this. And in addition, under the grain requirements for NSLP, 2 ounce equivalent of grain-based dessert per week is allowed to count toward the grain component for K through 12. SFSP, on the other hand, requires grains on a daily basis and credits them in terms of serving sizes, as Brittany also talked about earlier with breakfast. So for example, a slice of bread, a muffin, a half a cup of pasta would meet the daily requirements for SFSP. And SFSP, as Brittany mentioned also, does not require those whole grain rich products. So the daily requirements for meat also differ between NSLP and SFSP. NSLP requires 1 ounce equivalent of meat alternate daily for K through 8 and 2 ounce equivalent meat alternate for 9 through 12. SFSP daily requirements for meat alternate are in the form of serving sizes, like the grains are. So 2 ounces of deli meat, 2 ounces of cheese, 1 large egg, etc. would meet the daily meat alternate requirements for SFSP. And lastly, and arguably the most difficult difference between NSLP and SFSP meal patterns are the fruit and vegetable requirements. And we'll also talk a little bit about milk on this slide as well. So NSLP requires a lot more when it comes to fruits and vegetables. Starting with fruit, K through 8 needs a half a cup of fruit daily, and 9 through 12 needs 1 cup fruit daily. And same with breakfast, no more than half of the fruit requirement for the week can be met by fruit juice. When it comes to vegetables, K through 8 needs 3/4 cup vegetables daily, and 9 through 12 needs 1 cup daily. The tricky part comes into play with the vegetable subgroups. Within the week, a variety of vegetables need to be offered in the form of vegetable subgroups. The subgroups consist of red orange, dark green, bean pea, starchy, and other vegetables. Depending on your service model, this can be pretty simple or somewhat difficult to achieve. We'll give some tips in the coming slides on how to meet the vegetable subgroup requirement within your menus. SFSP simply requires a 3/4 cup serving of fruit/vegetable, which must be in the form of at least 2 food items. There are not vegetable subgroup requirements, which makes the transition from SFSP back to NSLP a little more complicated, as opposed to the other way around, which we did this past fall. As far as milk is concerned, 1 cup or 8 ounces is needed for both meal patterns. However, as Brittany talked about earlier as well, NSLP, you have to offer at least 2 options, and they must be low fat, unflavored, or fat-free flavored or unflavored, with unflavored being offered at each meal service. Under SFSP, you only need to offer one option and the type doesn't matter. Again, sharing some visuals here. These are screenshots of an NSLP and SFSP meal pattern for lunch. We've included the link as we talked about earlier on our resource slide for the FDAX visual on the left, and then also the SFSP meal pattern on the right from the USDA SFSP nutrition guide. So we can refer to those on our resource page. And you can't probably see them in a ton of detail because it's a little bit small, but these are really great summaries of all the meal pattern and dietary specifications we just talked about, and are helpful tools when you have menu planning to do this fall. So keep those on hand as a helpful tool. And I do want to point out that you can see more of the vegetable subgroup requirements elaborated upon on the NSLP meal pattern image. So we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move forward with our tips and tricks. But for now, we will give an overview and then get into some examples. So one last comparison to consider as you're switching from SFSP to NSLP. If you follow your SFSP menus from this past year, you will more than likely not meet all the requirements you need for NSLP. First, as we reviewed, there are not enough servings of fruits and vegetables on the SFSP menu to meet the requirements for NSLP. So SFSP only requires that 3/4 cup portion, whereas NSLP needs anywhere from a half cup to a cup of fruit and 3/4 cup to a full cup of vegetable daily based on those grade groups. Additionally, you may not meet the calorie, sodium, and saturated fat requirements. So as we talked about earlier with SFSP, there aren't any dietary specifications that NSLP menus do have. So unless you're planning unless your SFSP menus were planned with this transition back to NSLP in mind, you'll more than likely not be compliant with those dietary specs for calories, sodium, and saturated fat, and you'll need to make some adjustments to make them compliant for NSLP. Lastly, you may not have enough food items in general on the menu. There are just enough differences between the daily and weekly requirements for components to make meeting the NSLP requirements difficult with an SFSP lunch menu. So let's take a look at some examples to help us put this knowledge into action. So taking a look at this meal, do you think it's compliant for the National School Lunch Program, Summer Food Service Program, or both? And you can see, and again, feel free to put it in the comments. We have a cup of vegetable here, half a cup of fruit, 2-ounce meat alternate, 1 ounce grain, and a choice of milk. So, we have a good question coming across. Some depending, it depends, both, if K8, yep, we got some good responses going here. So yes, you are right if you're saying both, but only for K through 8, exactly. So we have more than enough of the 3/4 cup vegetable needed for K through 8 on a daily basis. We have the 1 ounce equivalent of grain minimum met, and we have 1 ounce equivalent of meat met, as well as that variety of 8-ounce servings of milk and a half a cup of fruit. So looking at this as a single day, this would meet the daily requirements for K through 8. You would need to look at your entire week, as we've talked about before, to consider if this works for the weekly requirements for meal components, as well as for dietary specifications. But I think some of you will probably know, what can we do to make this work for 9th through 12th graders? There are just a couple simple things we can do, and feel free to put those in the chat if you have an idea. And I'll give it a second and we can switch to the next slide to see the right answer. So to make this work for 9th through 12th graders, we're just adding a half a cup of fruit make it a 1 cup serving of fruit, and adding 1 ounce equivalent of grain. So the previous meal was just a half a cup shy on the daily 1 cup fruit requirement and 1 ounce short on the daily 2 ounce equivalent grain requirement for those 9th through 12th graders. So just an easy switch to get those components where they need to be and meet those 9 through 12 requirements. But looking at this meal, you know, we also might be adding something like a condiment for the mashed potatoes, adding gravy, maybe some dipping sauce for the chicken nuggets, maybe a butter pat for your bun. Those types of things you would need to take a closer look at the nutrient requirements for calories, saturated fat, and sodium to really make sure you're in compliance. So that's our first example. Now we'll move on to another. So do you think this meal is compliant for NSLP, SFSP, or both? Feel free to add to the comments if you have an idea. So we're looking at 1/2 cup of corn, 1/2 cup of vegetable, 1/2 cup of fruit, 2 ounce equivalent of meat, 2 ounce equivalent of grain, and a choice of milk. So we have, I see an SFSP in there. Yes, that is correct. So it is compliant for SFSP, but not NSLP. We're missing a few items to make this compliant for NSLP. So I'm going to give you a second to think about maybe what's missing. And the next slide will show us what we can do to add to this meal to make it work for NSLP. Yep, so different sizes of fruits and vegetables might impact what they credit for. So this apple we're saying is only 1/2 cup. So if we're to make this work for NSLP, I'll advance and we can see that we need some more fruits and veggies. So the previous meal only included 1/2 cup of both fruit and vegetable. So under NSLP, we need at least 3/4 cup for the K through 8 level and 1/2 cup of fruit for K through 8 and 1 cup of vegetable and 1 cup of fruit for 9 through 12. So increasing those fruits and vegetables will meet the NSLP requirements for fruits and vegetables on a daily basis. And then this would be compliant for 9 through 12. It would exceed what we need for K through 8, which is okay. But again, you need to take a look at those nutrient requirements to see if this works for whichever grade group you're wanting to serve it for. And with that, I'll pass it over to Brittany to start sharing some of our tips and tricks for menu compliance.
All right, thanks, Hannah. So there are 5 vegetable subgroup requirements under the National School Lunch Program. They include dark green, which is items like broccoli, romaine, spinach, red orange, items like tomatoes, carrots, sweet potatoes, starchy, which would be vegetables like corn, potatoes, green peas, the bean peas subgroup, which could be any kind of bean like black beans, red beans, lentils, chickpeas, and then other, where a lot of veggies fall under, like celery, cauliflower, cucumber, onions, and mushrooms. In the summer food service program, leafy greens and dried fruit credit at the volume served. But in the National School Lunch Program, leafy greens only credit at half the volume served. So if you were making a salad and you used 1 cup of romaine, that would only credit as a 1/2 cup of dark green vegetable. If you bump that up to 2 cups, it could then credit as just 1 cup of dark green vegetable. The dried fruit in the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program credits as double the volume served. So if you had a 1/4 cup pack of craisins, that would actually count as a 1/2 cup of fruit. So variety is really key when it comes to maintaining compliance with the USDA school meal pattern standards. Fresh, frozen, canned, or dried fruit and vegetable choices can all be really great options. Students will get excited when you can weave in seasonal favorites into the menu that go beyond the standard apples, oranges, bananas, and carrots, such as Satsuma tangerines, grapes, or maybe even butternut squash in the winter. Adding a daily salad entree option to the menu can also be a great way to ensure that you are meeting those vegetable subgroup requirements over the course of the week. A dark leafy green salad can be topped with veggies from any and all subgroups. You could throw some shredded carrots, chickpeas, corn, and cucumbers on there, and you would have met all 5 subgroups. Find out what your students like and leverage that insight. Maybe your high school students prefer roasted broccoli or cooked carrots over serving them raw. Maybe your elementary students prefer something like applesauce over a fresh apple because it's much easier for them to eat. So some other tips here. I do often see many extras added to the menu during the summer, like chips, cookies, slices of bacon, things like that. And while these items can be really great participation boosters, don't forget that when we do switch back to the school breakfast program and National School Lunch Program standards, each of those extra food items has to be accounted for in the nutrient specifications. So sometimes that extra calories, saturated fat, and sodium from serving those items too frequently can really push you above the weekly nutrition standards. So if you are serving these items regularly in the summer program, maybe you consider limiting any grain-based desserts to once a week when switching back to the National School Lunch Program. And items like chips, perhaps you leave that off the regular plan menu and just allow students to purchase those items a la carte. If you're serving something like regular bacon at breakfast and that puts you over the saturated fat threshold, then you might have to evaluate switching to a lower fat creditable item such as turkey bacon. It's really all about give and take. As you can see on this slide, the key message is to switch things up, going in with our variety theme. So by offering a variety of entrees, you will be better able to work within those nutrient thresholds a little easier. In our experience, we have found that this can be accomplished by limiting high-fat, higher sodium items like breakfast pizzas and biscuit sandwiches to 1 to 2 times per week, maximum at breakfast, and then limiting the use of high-fat, higher sodium luncheon meats like hot dogs, ham, pepperoni, as much as possible. We also would recommend limiting entrees that contain a lot of cheese as the main or meat alternate to 1 to 2 days per week. Another suggestion we have is to focus on what you can add to your menu. So if you are offering some of those student favorites that are higher calorie, fat, and sodium entree items, maybe consider balancing them out with some additional lower calorie, fat, and sodium options. So things like adding fresh salads or a fruit and yogurt parfait with granola, or a bento box to the menu. And maybe that bento box has something like a hard-boiled egg with cheese cubes and grapes, or a pretzel with chickpea or sun butter dip and apple slices. Lots of different options there. So I will pass it back to you, Hannah, to share some additional tips and tricks for nutrient compliance.
Thanks, Brittany. So we also recommend comparing the nutrition facts labels listed on products that are similar in price, quality, and the way it credits towards your meal pattern requirements. So this comparison allows you to find and choose the item that is lower in saturated fat and sodium and can therefore help you be compliant in your menu. So of course, if your students have a favorite product that really drives participation, such as a favorite chicken tender or pizza product, you may not have to pull it from the menu just because you found another one that's slightly lower in something like sodium. Instead, figure out where you can and cannot compromise, and first look at replacing other entrees and side items that may be less noticeable to your students. If your menus are running high in saturated fat, you can also consider switching to skim milk instead of 1%. And also consider the use of PC packets or use 1 and 2 ounce pre-portioned souffle cups for condiments, as well as fat-free or low-fat versions as possible to keep those calories, sodium, and saturated fat in line. When it comes to sodium, staying below the sodium threshold seems to be particularly challenging for districts and could be even more challenging if we don't see that sodium target at 1 instead of 2 that may happen with this final ruling. As I mentioned in the previous slide, be sure to compare the sodium content for similar foods when you determine which products you'll feature on your menu. So foods that are low in sodium contain less than 140 milligrams per serving or 5% daily value. Choose products with the lowest amount of sodium when price and quality are similar, so that give and take. Train your kitchen staff to not add salt to recipes unless it isn't listed as an ingredient. A lot of times your recipes have a lot of flavor from other ingredients without adding any salt. So really think twice before adding additional salt to those recipes. Another option is to use different herbs and spices as seasonings in place of salt. So choosing reduced sodium seasoning blends like homemade taco seasoning or Mrs. Dash, when possible, is a great option. The Child Nutrition Sharing site has a few recipes for no sodium herb and seasoning blends that you could try out for yourself, which I've linked here in this slide. And also you could consider modifying cooking methods to add additional flavor profiles by roasting or sauteing vegetables, or if you have access to a grill, you could grill foods to add some additional flavor without salt. So this is our resource slide. It provides a link to the resources we referenced throughout the presentation, as well as a few others for menu planning. So the first link is to the FDACS meal pattern document, which is really helpful to keep at the ready when planning your SSO meals for the 21-22 school year. The USDA SFSP nutrition guide includes very detailed meal pattern information for SFSP meals if you don't already have that in your toolkit. The Child Nutrition Sharing site, which I just referenced, and USDA have a lot of great menu planning resources as well. The second to the last link is to the 21-22 waivers and flexibilities that USDA has released. So it's always a good idea to reference these if you have any questions about the waivers, or of course your state agency. The final link is to Healthy Pro's back-end session resources, which was a presentation or session they did a couple weeks ago. It's good to keep those resources at hand because menu planning is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to planning for back to school. So the resources they shared in the back-end session webinar, they have a ton of other great resources and tips for preparing for your back to school this upcoming school year. So to wrap things up, let's just summarize the main takeaways from today's session. Offer a variety of items on your menu. That can look like providing fresh, canned, dried, and frozen produce options. It can also include switching up the entrees you offer to help you better meet the nutrient requirements, limiting high fat, high sodium breakfast and lunch items to 1 to 2 times per week max, and considering what nutrient rich but lower calorie, saturated fat, and sodium items you can add to your menu is a great place to start. Additionally, be flexible with your menu. If this year has taught us anything, it's that nothing ever goes exactly as planned. Similarly, your menu isn't set in stone. Shortages and missed deliveries happen. Seasonal produce offers opportunities for great freshness and flavor. Students' flavor preferences change, so on and so forth. Use these hurdles and opportunities to innovate and create a menu that can change with what comes your way. Additionally, know where you can compromise. If you know your students love 1% milk, keep it on the menu, but incorporate more fresh salads and other lower saturated fat items. Same with other items on your menu. If students won't eat the less expensive orange chicken, buy the more expensive kind and balance the week out with a commodity-heavy meal. In order to know where you can compromise, you need to ask your students for feedback. Send out a Google form or other survey to find out what students like and dislike on the menu, and ask what new items they would like to see featured. Or you could form a student focus group to gather information, and I think you'll find that they're more willing to provide feedback and give their 2 cents than you think. Lastly, even the best menu planner could use some help. Consider bringing in a software program like Healthy Pro, and that can help you take the guesswork out of your menu planning. We plan menus for districts using Healthy Pro software, and it is a game changer. If you aren't already connected to a software program, this fall might be the time to do so in order to take a few things off your plate. So we want to thank you so much for joining us for our session today. I hope you gained some valuable insight to use this fall when you're planning your SSO menus under NSLP and SBP. If you want to learn more about us, visit our website, follow us on social media at ProTeam Advisors, shoot us an email, give us a call. We're truly here to help. So now we should have a few minutes for questions.
So thank you very much, Hannah and Brittany. It was very helpful to see it clearly defined, and with the pictures, I think that was a big piece that everyone appreciated. There have been a number of questions. One of them kind of goes to the root of why are we switching to SSO from SFSP? We did it last year. What's the thought behind the switch?
So Ellie Pace actually answered that in the chat. So I'm just going to read what she said. She's actually a member of ProTeam as well, and another regulatory guru. So let's see. The reimbursement rate for the SSO is usually the same as the National School Lunch Program, but you can receive additional commodity dollars. In addition, for school year 21-22, USDA increased the SSO reimbursement rate to that of the summer food service program. So you'll get the SSO rate for your commodity dollars and more money total per meal if you were to follow the SSO for school year 2021-22. Than if you were to just do the NSLP or SBP. Another main difference is that you can feed all children who ask for a meal for free under SSO, but you'd only be able to feed kids enrolled under the NSLP and SBP.
And just one more follow-up on that part about SSO versus NSLP. A question was, do fruits and vegetables all credit in the same manner? So subgroups and amounts.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I get the right program.
Do fruits and vegetables credit the same way in SSO as they do in NSLP? I'm guessing subgroup requirements and portions.
Yeah, so the SSO has no separate meal pattern. It just follows the NSLP meal pattern. So therefore, it would have to follow the NSLP meal pattern subgroup requirements.
Okay. Another question was asked in regard to CACFP and the changes for their guidelines as well for the upcoming school year.
So no changes that I have seen so far. If you have a supper program, you would still follow those same meal patterns. If you are serving pre-K students, you would still need to follow the CAC breakfast, lunch, snack meal patterns, unless you get some kind of exemption for commingling.
And also in the CACFP world, because sugar is one of their issues, if you could restate what the sugar requirement is for CACFP, and then also is there a sugar requirement in school breakfast, national school lunch, SSO?
So the CACFP, they don't have weekly nutrient standards like the NSLP and SBP, but there are sugar limits, particularly for preschool for items like yogurt and cereal. For the NSLP and the school breakfast program, there isn't a sugar limit like there is for sodium per se, but there are weekly calorie limits. And so the thought is that if you're serving a bunch of high sugar items, they're going to be higher in calories. So you would be limited by those ranges, but there's not a set limit for those programs. The only other kind of nuance with sugar is anything around a la carte. So there are some sugar limits for the items that you would sell under the Smart Snack in schools regulations.
Okay. And one more question was asked about initially someone was told they needed to serve beans every day on their menu. So this kind of goes to a question about with NSLP SSO, if I want to offer additional serving lines, do I need to make sure each line includes all the vegetable subgroups, or can each bar just offer one each day?
I can speak to that, Brittany. Just the fact that over the course of the week, that specific line, if a student were to go to just that line all week, they would need to have access to all the subgroups throughout the week. So whether you choose to do multiple options per day or vary them over the week, you just need to make sure that all those subgroups are offered to each student based on if they visit one line or multiple lines over the course of the week.
Another question that was asked or has been asked in the future a lot is, can I serve a 6-12 lunch under NSLP because my students are all coming at different times now?
Do you want me to jump in, Hannah? Or?
Well, I mean, yeah, either of us could speak to this, that, you know, grade groups, only specific grade groups can be combined under the SF or NSLP and SBP meal patterns. So for breakfast, we can have a K8 and 9-12. Those are kind of the biggest groupings you can have. Whereas under, or excuse me, you can do K12 as well with that. There's two different options there for larger groupings. And then under lunch, you can do K8 and 9-12, but there's no 6-12 or K12 like there is for breakfast. You, in that case, would need to request a waiver of the meal pattern grade groupings that you're following, because there's no crossover between the 6-8 and the 9-12 meal pattern for lunch.
And another question was, are there different changes for the snack requirements?
Not to my knowledge, I haven't seen any differences. So you should still be able to just serve 2 of the 4 components. And then if you look at that meal pattern, it gives you the portion sizes. So a cup of milk, an ounce of grain or an ounce of meat, and then 3/4 of a fruit or vegetable serving. I'm just picking 2 of the 4.
Okay. If you do have additional questions, you can feel free to put them into the chat. I have another one here that says, when sticking to the menu, it's really hard because of out of stocks in the past. How do we stay with our planned menu?
Yeah, that's, I think, a big thing everyone has been struggling with this year. And it's really, I mean, doing your research, knowing what products are available to you and having backup products in mind is really important. You know, for some of those entrees or for products like your vegetables or fruits, you know, canned products are pretty consistent across the board. Same with fresh and frozen. So there's not a lot of difference nutritionally. So keeping those couple options in your shopping list available to your staff is good. You know, replacing unavailable items with those that are crediting similarly. So romaine, broccoli, spinach, they're all those dark green vegetables, keeping those easy swaps in mind. Obviously, recording things on your production records if you ever need to change anything is key to your record keeping. And then, you know, if you're really, really struggling on a consistent basis, contacting your state agency to see if there's some sort of temporary waiver that you could get to deviate from the meal pattern.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for your questions and your participation. That certainly, if one person asks a question, we know there's more people behind it. So it's wonderful that you put that information in there. And Hannah and Brittany, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in this area. A question was asked about the links on the PowerPoint. When we send the information out, later, we will be able to have those links available. Unfortunately, they didn't show in the chat. So
Okay.
thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.